All right. Thank you, Fernanda, and thanks everyone for showing up. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening. It looks like you're everywhere in the world. Um, I'm Sasha Chavkin. I'm a reporter with The Examination. We are an investigative newsroom that covers global public health and the environment. And I'm now going to share my screen and talk about my investigation. All right. So this is an investigation about greenwashing um, and sustainable loans that went to companies in polluting industries. And I'm also going to talk specifically about how to use private financial data sets from companies like LSEG or Bloomberg in order to investigate banks and corporations. Um, and I'm going to start by going through the investigation, and then I'm going to go behind the scenes and talk about how we did the project. So this is the story. It was published by The Examination in partnership with the Associated Press, Toronto Star, and Mississippi Today. One of the coolest parts of the project, I think, is an illustrated feature that we did explaining some of our key findings. So I'm kind of going to walk you through that to start, both to explain in a nutshell what we discovered, and because I think it's cool. And these illustrations are done by Alejandra Saavedra, who's the great illustrator who we worked with on this. Um, so in 2017, banks and corporations were feeling more and more pressure to do something about climate change. So together, they developed a new kind of product, a new kind of lending product. And that product is called sustainability-linked loans. And they ended up giving out more than $1.5 trillion in these loans between 2008 and 2023. So it's a huge, huge sector that became one of the largest areas of green finance overall. Now, there's a few things you should know about what a sustainability-linked loan is. Basically, it's a loan where a company gets to pay a lower interest rate to the bank if it promises that it will meet certain environmental targets. It could cut carbon emissions, it could clean up its supply chain, it could even do social targets like increasing the diversity of its workforce. But there's a catch, which is that unlike traditional green loans, they don't actually have to spend the money on green projects. They can spend the money on anything they want, just on general business purposes, as long as they say they're going to do this sustainability part on the side. And these SLLs are private contracts with no disclosure or transparency requirements for what progress they're making or even what the exact benchmarks are. So literally, as a company, I could just announce, I got a $1 billion SLL from Citibank to reduce my carbon emissions. And I don't really have to say anything else to the public. And then I am online to get reduced interest rates in the years that that loan is in effect. Our investigation found that almost $300 billion in SLLs, which represented about 1 in 5 dollars in the total market, went to industries that jointly are responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. Industries that are serious contributors to climate change. Those include the fossil fuel industry, the mining industry, food and agriculture, timber, and companies that are part of the Forest 500, which is an index of companies created by a group called Global Canopy of the corporations that have the biggest exposure to tropical deforestation worldwide. For some of the companies that we investigated in depth, we found that their emissions actually increased as they had SLLs that were tied to decarbonization. Essentially, there was so little transparency, and there was so much room to manipulate the metrics of these loans, that their own documents showed that their overall emissions increased, essentially as they were getting paid to be more sustainable, and even getting paid for claims that they were cutting carbon emissions. So that's the overview. Now I want to talk about how we did it, and particularly to talk about how we used private financial databases, because they were absolutely essential to this. And I think they're a tool that a lot of journalists could benefit from. This story started from a previous investigation I did for the Rainforest Investigations Network about China's state-run food importer, which is a company called COFCO. And the investigation found that it still got soy for many farms in Brazil that were linked to deforestation. And while it was linked to these farms, it was getting billions of dollars in sustainability-linked loans. And that made me wonder, well, what's going on in a global picture with SLLs? It made me want to globalize the story. So I wanted to search for global data that could give some insight into this very opaque industry where there were not public disclosure requirements. The place where we ended up starting was these private financial databases, LSEG, which used to be called Refinitiv, which ended up being the source of the data we used in the investigation. And then there are similar databases like that, Bloomberg, Dealogic, Morningstar, and so on. And those have non-public data about these SLLs that, it doesn't provide the full picture, but it provides much more than has been reported on before. But the catch with these data sets is that they're super, super expensive. And they, cost tens of thousands of dollars for subscriptions, which was not something that I was in a position to pay. So I had to try to figure out a way to get in. I wrote to LSEG, and because they said they provided data to journalists, and they did give me some data, but they wouldn't give me all the data I wanted, which was essentially everything on SLLs over, a 6-year period. So what I ended up doing was working with a consulting group called Datadesk. And these are two guys who have formed an investigative consultancy. They work with journalists and NGOs. And essentially what they do is they pay for these fancy subscriptions to financial data sets, and then you could hire them to do analysis for you and to provide access to the data. And that's how we were able to get in. And we did have to pay them, it was a couple $1,000s, but it was still a small fraction of what we would have paid otherwise. Later in the process, we were also working with the Toronto Star, and the paper had access to Bloomberg. So we were able to use Bloomberg data as well to kind of double check and confirm some of our findings. Now, the key analysis at the core of this story was about the polluting industries that were getting SLLs. And this was a lot of work. You could see sort of what the spreadsheet looked like. Kang, who's the excellent data editor at Pulitzer Center, and also our great data editor, Mago Torres, at the examination, were very much involved in this process. And basically what we did was we used industry classifications within the LSEG data to come up with totals of the amount of SLLs that were going to these 5 industries we had selected, fossil fuels, mining, and so on. There were some hiccups that we had to work out. Um, I was really excited at the beginning of the process because I thought I had an amazing story, and I actually convinced the AP, which was who I was working with, that I could do this story ahead of the whole project, because what the data said was that JBS, the world's biggest beef producer and a huge deforester, had a sustainability linked load. Then I emailed JBS, and you could see that, and they said, "What are you talking about? We have no idea what this is about." And I had this moment of panic where I wondered if the data that I was relying on was trustworthy. And we had to email the LSEG company and say, like, is there an error in your data set on SLLs? And it turned out that what had happened was that the loan to JBS had SLL provisions that could be activated in the future, but they hadn't actually been activated. So a bank had reported this loan as an SLL, but it wasn't actually one where JBS was benefiting from reduced interest rates or was making environmental promises. So I wasn't able to do that story, but I was also relieved because it showed that the data wasn't at fault, and it explained how it worked, that this was based on reporting by banks and companies, and that it had to be double checked when I was going to go in depth on an individual case. So I then had to find a central case for the story. And we ended up looking at Drax Group, which is this huge wood bioenergy company. The wood biomass industry gets huge subsidies in Europe and the UK and parts of Asia for burning wood pellets for energy. And they present themselves as clean energy companies. And Drax has gotten hundreds of millions of dollars in SLLs, in which it claims that it is reducing emissions by switching from using coal for power to burning wood pellets. Now, the catch is that scientists have found that when you actually look at the whole life cycle and add it up, wood biomass is worse for the climate and emits even more carbon than coal. So when you count cutting down the trees and burning the wood and shipping the pellets and that whole process, you're actually doing even more damage with wood biomass. We also found that Drax produces its wood pellets in poor, mostly Black communities in the US South. And the people in those communities are getting serious, debilitating respiratory problems that they say are caused by Drax's air pollution. There's now a $6 million federally funded study in the US going on to investigate whether all these people who are literally saying that they can't breathe in these towns where Drax and other wood pellet companies have facilities are caused by this industry. So we went and reported on the ground in the town of Gloucester, Mississippi, which is where these pictures are from. And we told the story of the people who were affected by Drax. In addition to the case study reporting, we also published the data on SLLs that we had analyzed. And we did this because we wanted to provide the transparency that was lacking in this huge, incredibly hidden industry where we had a lot of evidence indicating that greenwashing was going on. And we had to negotiate to make sure that we weren't violating Data Desk subscription with LSEG. But basically, when we narrowed down to just the companies in the polluting industries that we looked at, and to presenting limited information on them, we were able to publish on our website, these hundreds of questionable loans that had previously been in the dark and not available for public scrutiny before. So I wanted to wrap it up with just a few takeaways that I think might be helpful if you're interested in doing these kinds of stories. One is that private financial databases can give you non-public information that you could use to build a story in an investigation. They're really expensive, but there are different ways you can get in, from consultants to just asking them for the data, if you just need a limited amount, or if you work for a big news organization or partnering with a big news organization, maybe you could get a Bloomberg terminal or access to some of this data yourself. You need to understand the data and its limitations, to not just have your story be about numbers, but to actually report on the ground and make clear who is being affected. And finally, to the extent you can, make the data public, and provide the transparency that is lacking. So I'm going to leave it there. Again, you have my name, my email if you want to be in touch, my social, and the account for the examination is there as well. And I'm now going to pass it along to Alex, who will talk about his investigation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sasha. Hi, everyone. So I'm tuning in from Paris, France. I've been working for a few years as a freelance journalist for the investigative outlet called Disclose. Let me share my screen with you. So you'll see that my presentation is also about, showing the financial aspect behind pollution cases harming the environment, and like trying to show how, in my case, French financial institutions can benefit from the oil and gas expansion in the Amazon region. So Sasha wanted to globalize. In our case, we wanted to localize as much as possible because there's like a lot of NGOs working on these subjects. So you have groups of NGOs publishing reports every year, such as Banking on Climate Chaos, Investing in Climate Chaos. Really recommend reading those. So we kind of have a lot of aggregated numbers of showing for each polluting company, fossil fuel company in the world, how many billions Citibank invested in, 2023, for example, or how many $billions in shares it holds in this and that company. What we wanted to do is go a bit beyond that, go look more into detail and really show on one precise example how French banks benefit from that activity in that country. And we also wanted to, through human stories, underground reporting, kind of burst the financial bubble and try to bring these stories to a larger audience, and to an audience that is not really, financially savvy, for example. So the goal of this investigation, and actually it was the pursuit of a work I've been doing for 2 years with Disclose. We were looking at, how French finance is supporting the coal industry in Germany. We showed how French financial institutions financed the expansion of the LNG industry in Texas, for example, that pollutes a lot. So we did a few stories about that, and we wanted to dig deeper and focus on the Amazon region because it's so important from a biodiversity point of view. And I mean, in France, at least, it is not well known that the Amazon region is also a hub for oil and gas activities, and that projects are really booming there. So the first step that we took was we wanted to identify key companies active in that region. So, you can find online through the reports I mentioned, so Banking on Climate Chaos, Investing in Climate Chaos, but also the NGO Stand Earth, also and Amazon Watch have done a lot of work on that, showing how large companies conduct oil and gas projects in the region and are harming the people there. So we had like, I would say, a few dozen of large companies in our list. And in order to decide on which company we would zoom in, that means really look closer at the financial data and then really go underground and tell the story. I started building this spreadsheet that you see a part of, where we had like the name of the company, and then we had like we put in all the data that is already published, financial data, linking that company to French financial institutions. We had also like what I call the potential of French implication involvement in that company. So that means if we saw that in the last years, in the aggregated numbers published online, French financial institutions were already supporting that company. I mean, this potential involvement would be higher or lower. And then we also were looking for potential, dirty projects. So are these companies known for specific projects that are really harmful to the environment? Can we find, this is all like open source research, can we find previous investigations about projects of these companies who are really dangerous for indigenous communities that are deforesting, etc.? And then at the end, we had like a few dozen names of companies, and we looked at all these factors and decided to zoom in on 6 of them, because we thought that they were they had really good chances of getting at least some French money, that they were involved in polluting projects in the Amazon, and that there would be some kind of tie between their activities in the Amazon and France. So it could be because they send maybe oil and gas to France or to Europe, or because French companies are buying on the market their energy, etc. So we had this list, and so we went back to the financial data that it was already out there. So I just put 2 examples here. So we wanted to look a bit more into detail, what kind of financing they were receiving, what kind of investments from which countries. So that also helped nourish the spreadsheet that I showed earlier, and also, decide one last time, do we really want to get on these companies or not? Why was it so important to narrow down that list? Because, well, we did it a bit differently than what Sasha told you. He worked with a data desk. What we did, we worked with a non-profit based in the Netherlands called Profundo. So they are specializing in financial analysis for civil society nonprofits. So as a independent newsroom, we get let's say a good deal. So they have access to all the expensive private databases that Sasha mentioned. They do the analysis for us on these companies. They extract the data that you want to for the time frame that you choose. And yeah, it was also for a few thousand euros that we get this result of really in detail how many shares of, let's say, Repsol, because it's one company I worked on, are owned by this particular bank in France. And you can also see in detail which subsidiary of the bank, and which country it's based, etc. So you can really get into the detail, and you can also, what's really interesting to us, because we focused on investments more than financing. So maybe just a quick word on that. The difference is that banks or financial institutions can invest in companies. So it means they can buy bonds, for example, back each year or trimester in interest rates or dividends. And the other Sorry, I'm back. I think it was cut off. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So where was I? Yeah, so I was saying the difference between investment and financing. So so banks can invest in companies by buying shares or bonds, and they can also finance them by giving them, for example, loans. It's the same way as you guys can get a loan for buying a house. So we wanted to look more into investments because we thought that it was kind of underreported, and also because there is less oversight on investments than you have on loans. So we found that interesting, and the data that Profundo gave us allowed us to get a precise number of, how much, for example, let's say one example of Crédit Agricole is a banking group in France. How much do they get every year in interest and dividends from the investments they have in Repsol? So we could come up with a number of how many million euros each year they get in profit from that. So that was interesting to advance that story. And then the last step, as Sasha also showed you, is of course going underground. It's more a say like more classical reporting work, investigation work. So we went to Peru. We wanted to look into Repsol's gas production in the rainforest there. So we went there, we looked at, we showed that the gas fields are under-regulated, that it's a lot of self-control by Repsol, that Repsol even, pays the people who are supposed to control it underground. We found environmental complaints against the company, against its activities, and we talked to indigenous people living there who told us how well the pollution of rivers affected their lives. And so this was just some a more classical part of the work, let's say maybe less nerdy, where you really just go talk to people and try to find the human voices that make readers want to listen to your story. And we did this story at Disclose in partnership with TV channel called France 24, France 24, and with a radio station called Radio France International. And so in the end, we had our articles that you see on the left side, and they produced a 16-minute TV documentary on that story, and also a 19-minute radio documentary on it. So it was also a way to reach as many people as possible, because these media outlets, they also broadcast in Spanish and Portuguese all around the world. And it was also, from a strategy point of view, interesting for us to have like a maybe more classical like web print result, and then also radio and TV. And we all worked together, and it was really nice to see how, journalists from all these types of media can work differently, but it's also very complementary. So yeah, that was what I wanted to tell you guys, and now I'm giving it to Bruna.
Thank you, Alex.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. I'm afraid that my internet connection is not that good today, but you let me know if something goes wrong. I'm Bruna. I'm from Brazil, and I'm reporting on Fiagro, which is an investment fund in agro-industrial productive chains in Brazil, created in 2021. So it's a recent investment fund, and its connection with the Amazon rainforest exploitation. So I'm trying to share my screen here. You guys are seeing my screen. So I'm going to start with the name of my project, Financial Market, a black box over green areas. And I titled the financial market as a black box in the first place, because I was trying to literally open the financial box of Fiagro. So Fiagro was a huge data set that was already publicly available online, but I wasn't able to interpret, to understand what was important for me to know and to dig into in order to connect it, to link to the Amazon exploitation. And the hypothesis that I had for this was that in Brazil, the traditional loans, those loans that farmers and ranchers and agri-industrial companies already access in traditional banks. So the history of these traditional loans are full of wrongdoings and social environmental wrongdoings. And the hypothesis was that in the private financial market, we would find that again. So this is the first story we published, trying to understand. And after 2 or 3 months reading financial documents and trying to open that black box, we were able to find and to prove with lots of financial sources and documents that there's no stringent regulation to filter deforesters or companies that are not green or sustainable at all, and filter them from the private credit in the Brazilian stock exchange, or even just in the capital market. So we found a total equity of 1 trillion reais, which is the Brazilian currency, that was being funneled to the agribusiness sector, and at least half of this amount was being funneled to farmers and ranchers and agri-industrial companies without asking them anything. It's very similar to the story Sasha told us in the first part of this section. So we found with an old school research, like reading so many financial documents, that JBS was using a lot those bonds, those agri-industrial funds, investment funds and bonds in the Brazilian stock exchange. And it was also switching the way they fund their operations from traditional loans in banks to the bonds and investment funds in the capital market inside Brazil and abroad. So using operations inside the B3, which is the Brazilian Stock Exchange, and trying to get listed abroad, and using bonds, agribusiness bonds, to fund our operations in other countries as well. And these two stories, we are maybe the most important link we found in our investigation, a 1-year-long investigation, analyzing data sets and cross-referencing financial data sets and environmental data sets in Brazil. So we were able to connect a senator in Brazil who is a rancher and who is responsible for purchasing cattle in Rondônia, an Amazonian state. And he does it because he owns feedlots in his state, a type of a center that buys cattle from dozens of farmlands around his feedlot. And he was being funded by a bond from Minerva. Minerva Foods is the Brazil's second largest meatpacking industry, after it is behind JBS, which is what was also mentioned here. And also Minerva was doing this, making use of the bonds, the agribusiness bonds, which are incorporated into Fiagro. So it is a complex financial chain. We're talking here about 2 different chains, a financial and the meat chain, and to connect these both deep chains into one. This first, here it is the senator story, and the first one with this cattle figure is about how Minerva is currently doing it, is using profits from bonds, from agribusiness bonds, to practice cattle laundering, illegal deforestation, and pressure on indigenous land, in Rondônia. Both stories are in Rondônia, in Amazonian state. And talking about a little bit of our methodology, in the first place, we spent, as I said, 2 to 3 months just reading financial documents and also talking to financial sources. So managers from these investment funds, managers from bonds, people who are, we call here in Brazil, Faria Limers, who are the people who work in the Faria Limer Avenue in São Paulo, the center of this financial industry. And I talked to several of them, and most of them didn't allow me to use their interviews. So it was a period of knowledging. I was gathering information to produce the stories. I was not enabled to use those interviews. And this part was crucial for my investigation because it allowed me to understand which financial documents were important. So I had that huge financial data set I mentioned before, and I had no idea what kind of documents would be useful for me to prove this connection, to prove my hypothesis, my first hypothesis. So after talking to them, I figured it out. And the next step was data scraping from the online, publicly available data sets, financial data sets. I'll show you a little bit more in the next slides. But that data scraping, that it was just possible because I was backed for the data and research team at the RAN Fellowship. And they funneled to me like more than 10,800 PDFs. So these files with each one of those with hundreds of pages, where I was able to find tables. And those tables were the gold of my investigation, because I found on those tables inside PDFs with lists of suppliers. So it was possible for us, after the data scraping, to extract tables with names of ranchers and farmers and companies in their national ID, such as CPF and CNPJ here in Brazil. So with both national IDs, we would be able to cross-reference it with embargoed areas lists, with fines, list of environmental fines from IBAMA in Brazil, the National Environmental Agency, and the kind of data sets. So after the table extraction, we uploaded it into RN data, which is similar as Aleph. It is available for journalists from the OCCRP, an OCCRP tool. And there we cross-reference the names of those lists. I can tell you it was hundreds of pages, and we could cross-reference those hundreds of pages with environmental data. So the key insights I pinpoint are to read as many financial documents as possible. Probably it is the same that my colleagues Sasha and Alex did during their investigations, because you need to get familiar with the financial language. They have a specific vocabulary, they have specific terms. I am a Portuguese native speaker, and I wasn't able to interpret several paragraphs of the financial documents that I was facing. So that period was very important. And then to combine this data scraping and all the refinement that the data was which the data passed with old school research. So we did it with interviews, with bothering financial sources. I have some of them that don't want to talk to me anymore after this investigation. So we did both things, and them combined, we were able to get to the data we wanted. And what I can say is that the private market is a treasure chest of stories. There are so many stories that I didn't have the time and the time to dig into those stories, those potential stories, because there are lots of them. So as environmental or financial journalists, we have a very big box of stories to dig into. And these are just 2 photographs that I brought to you guys, just for you to have an idea of our field trip work. We went to those areas that we connected to Fiagro. So Fiagro incorporated agribusiness bonds, and those agribusiness bonds were private credit for meatpacking industries or other industries from the agribusiness sectors. And those companies need suppliers to fuel their industry. So the resources, and this is specified into the financial documents, they use the money, they use the private resources to pay for suppliers. Well, and as Fernanda asked me for a hands-on tip, I brought here a screenshot of fundos.net, which was my databases, the main databases I accessed. This is the first page of fundos.net. Fundos is the Portuguese word for investment funds. In there, this database is from B3, the Brazilian Stock Exchange maintains this with hundreds of documents that are demanded from the similar of the SEC in Brazil, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Our acronym in Portuguese is CVM. So CVM demands, is the government body that regulates the capital market in Brazil, and it demands periodical documents from investment funds managers, from securitization firms, from all those offices that work with bonds and funds, and they need to publish it. So this is the database that I used, and you're able to put the name of the fund if you're interested in a specific fund, or you can use several other filters to filter that. And you're going to find these demanded documents. That was I was trying to tell you about getting familiar with financial documents, because I don't know what a report or a notice to the shareholders can offer me for my journalistic research. So I was trying to understand which of those documents would be important for my investigation, and that happened, and you can download them. So this is where you're gonna find the bonds incorporated by Fiagros, and those bonds are in the name of several non-sustainable companies in Brazil and abroad. Maybe I didn't have the time to check if there are several foreign companies making use of those bonds, but this is a potential investigation for you guys. So thank you very much. These are my addresses. You can reach out, and I'm gonna pass it on to Fernanda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruna, Sasha, and Alexander. It was great to know a bit more about the backstage and the practical insights and tips. Our panelists have been already answering some questions per writing, but please feel free to continue using the Q&A button. And we're going to go for some questions on mic that we feel would be valuable for everybody. So, Bruna, Alex Walker is asking, and I think this one is more directed to you, what were the methods that you used to extract the tables from the PDFs?
Okay, so Alex, I used Pinpoint from Google. So you're able to, they have a table extraction tool there. It was not 100% good for my investigation because I had, as I told you, hundreds of pages with those lists of suppliers. So I also used another one. I can't remember the name, but I'm gonna search for it and put it on the chat. But it was both free tools. So Pinpoint for journalists, you can have access by being a journalist. And this other tool that I used was also free. So I'm gonna put it on the chat.
Okay, thank you. Chris Welsford as well. He has a question about when you're investigating funds that could be related to greenwashing, and during the course of the research, you find out that this company is maybe a private company and it's more difficult to investigate it. And then Alexander had a very good answer, and if you could share it on mic, Alex, please.
Yes, so I'm looking for yeah, so exactly. So yeah, the question was about these more opaque companies. So the data sets that we mentioned, we worked with Sasha and I, they show you where the money comes from to specific companies. For example, which financial institution has invested money in it or has loaned money to this specific company, but it doesn't tell you how it's managed once it has arrived. So what the company really does with it. In some cases, you have loans where you have like a purpose of this loan that is really very clear. So for example, I don't know, extension of said refinery in that specific city. But most of the time you have investment in loans that are done for how they put it, it's general corporate purposes. So that means a group or a company can use it any way it sees fit. So it could really circulate inside the company. So it's difficult then to keep track of that money. So yeah, I would just really recommend alternatives to data sets. So, you know, looking for leaks. By leaks, I mean, you know, like, well, the data sets could be email troves, whatever, that are published online. And there are actually some websites and groups that are specialized in publishing them, indexing them, and sharing them with the public, like DDoS Secrets, for example. You can contact them and they can also share leaks with you that are not published yet. So you can just have a look at what it's already online. You have a lot of, like, hundreds of leaks of companies. I mean, I found last week I was looking for leaks on companies, and I found really specific mining companies in Brazil, Indonesia, that were not published in any article, to my knowledge, at least. So there's like a lot of data on these leaks already. And then, I mean, the rest, if you're a journalist, you know that, right? So you look for ex-employees, you look for, you know, people who could talk about the company, who worked for the company. Maybe the company has done work with like a public entity at some point. That's a good way to, you know, target the public entity with FOIA requests about this project. And maybe you can find out more. Maybe you can get documents from the private company you actually want to investigate, but that the public entity has to share with you. So there could all be, you know, strategies, different possibilities. Yeah.
I want to add one thing to that that has been successful in some of my past stories, which is looking for people who have filed lawsuits against a company. You know, especially if you have a company that's large or has been around a while, there tend to be people who have filed suits against it, and they tend to be either former employees or former business partners who actually know a lot about how the company operates. And so I've gotten some really good insights just by looking up lawsuits. In the United States, you could do that with PACER for any case in federal court. But different countries have legal databases where you can find that information.
Sasha, just a little bit of a hook on that. There is a question from an anonymous attendee that wants to know, when we're investigating private market companies, are there any unconventional or overlooked places that journalists should explore, in your opinion?
So I guess along the lines of what Alex was saying, leaks can be helpful. ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, has an offshore leaks database where you could look for a company and essentially see if they're affiliated with any kind of offshore holdings. And also you can see some of the people connected with the company's offshore holdings as well, depending on what data is available. That would be the one that comes to mind right now.
Maybe also if you look into a specific company that has a presence in several countries. So for example, you look into a company, let's say in Indonesia, because you live there and you want to investigate something, and it's a group that has a subsidiary in the US, for example, and in, let's say, Luxembourg. Well, you can access a lot of financial data in Luxembourg because they have a registry that is pretty transparent. And in the US, there's also like the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, that is great to get lists of even sometimes suppliers, if we talk about like conflict minerals and such. So there are actually a lot of public data, but spread all around the world. So you have to think of globally, like if you look at a group, think of where maybe the data would be most transparent. And often you get data in this specific country, which has transparency laws, and you can get data about even parts of the group where it's not as transparent. So there could be also a way to look at it.
I also remember after Alex mentioned the SEC, the Form 10K. Form 10K for the companies that want to get listed on the New York Stock Exchanges, a piece of several financial informations. They put there in detail what they have been through in the last decade, for example. So you're able to access financial information in detail in the 10K form. And probably there is a kind of 10K form in whatever stock exchange you want worldwide. So in Brazil, I don't know the name of this document. And there is also the annual report. So the traditional annual reports for listed companies, they are published every quarter, and they reunite the most important information once a year. And it is a box of financial information as well. Even you need to have patience, or you use AI to discover what is more important in for what you're looking for inside the document.
I would add, particularly for green finance, which we're talking about today, a lot of companies have sustainability reports that they put out every year, particularly companies that are trying to present themselves as green. And that's where they really put their boldest, most slickly produced claims about all the environmental good that they're doing in the world, as well as data in which they disclose whatever progress they are willing to disclose. So, for example, in the story that I just shared, one of the companies we looked at was Enbridge, which is a pipeline company that got a huge SLL and claimed that it was involved in decarbonization. And we were actually able to find in their own sustainability reports information showed that their overall greenhouse gas emissions, when you counted scope 3 emissions, were increasing. So I would suggest sustainability reports if you have a focus on green claims.
Very nice tip. Sasha, there's a question here directed to you, and it asks, Sasha, do you have advice for finding lawsuits without having to pay for pacer searches? I've tried this method, but found it very expensive.
I generally have worked with Pacer. There's other data sets like Westlaw, but I don't think they're any less expensive. My suggestion, if you have knowledge of a particular case, you can try looking it up, just, Jones versus Exxon, and sometimes there will be documents posted online. But if you're searching in general for lawsuits, I don't know a way of doing that outside of legal databases.
Nice. I think we answered all of our questions, and I would like to invite the panelists for like a final word to share with our guests today, to inspire them on their investigations, and then we can call it a day. You first, Bru, please.
Thank you very much. I truly appreciate the time I spent with you, and the Q&A was very useful for me as well to think about my investigations and the tools I'm using, the data sets I'm accessing. So thank you very much, and get in touch if you have any financial idea for investigating some company. That's what we need, journalists, to investigate companies, corporations worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander.
Yeah, I mean, the data set that we bought has actually, data on a lot of companies, a lot of banks. We just focus on the French ones, but we have, about almost every major bank in the world tied to these 6 polluting companies. So if some of you want to look into it, maybe we can find a way of sharing it with you, and yeah, you can contact me. You can find me online with my name, and we can discuss.
And over to you, Sasha.
Thanks. Well, thanks so much to everyone for joining us and taking the time to listen. I would say my main advice is not to be intimidated by the idea of financial data. I think we, as journalists, and myself in the past, tend to think of it as something that is both generally inaccessible to us and as too complicated to be worth the trouble. And I think that there are solutions, whether it's the kind of private financial data sets that I've discussed, or working with consultants or NGOs like Alex and Bruna did. I think that there are ways of getting access, and I would encourage you to try to do that. And yeah, I will leave it there.
Thank you all so much. And thank you all for attending today. See you next time.